think you do have one very big choice to make in life, and that is your partner selection. I did always have this dream of fashion, but from where I grew up in the Bay Area, that was a very far-fetched reality. There's something about being young that even I wish I could still hold on to more, which is having nothing to lose. And this fearlessness. And you haven't had too much negative feedback yet.
You haven't been hit
you're kind of not crushed,
right?
And that was definitely the case for me.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode number 7 of the Success Series. I'm your host, David Berg. I'm here alongside Michael Konowski, our co-host, and our guest of today is Erin Fetherston. Erin started her career in fashion and developed a really successful fashion line for a woman, started in Paris, ended up in New York City. She's now expanded to interior design and has just launched a collaboration with Anthropologie, combining both home and fashion. I'm excited to be here with you today, Erin, and the floor is yours.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I love that you're doing this podcast, and it's a pleasure to speak with you.
Awesome. I know I gave a high-level intro of your career, but if you could just share a little bit more about, you went from fashion to interior design, and now it seems like both worlds are colliding, so.
Yeah. Well, I was very fortunate. I grew up in the Bay Area of California. I went to UC Berkeley, and I really had this strong draw and passion to study fashion design. As soon as I graduated UC Berkeley, I moved to Paris to attend Parson School of Design in Paris. And I ended up staying on in Paris to create my first collection, which I showed in Paris on the runways of Paris.
Very cool.
And was fortunate to have a strong start and eventually moved to New York City, where I showed in New York Fashion Week for over a decade. I had some really phenomenal moments in my career. I was making clothes at the designer level, but early in the trend of mass retailers partnering with high-end designers, I had Target come to me in 2006, and I had just about only 3 runway shows under my belt. And they asked me if I would be interested in doing one of their Target high-end fashion collaborations, which I, of course, said yes to. It was an amazing opportunity, and I was only 25 years old.
Wow.
And simultaneously, I was participating in the CFDA Vogue Fashion Fund, which is back then pre-social media. That they were really the gatekeepers. So for upcoming young design talent, that was really, important to kind of come up in the fashion system. So I had those two things come out at the same time in 2007, which really helped me establish my brand. And it was sold at all the major US and international department stores. And I went on to have other fun career highlights. I was, in addition to having my own line, guest creative director at UC Couture in 2010, and launched a secondary line called Erin Fetherston in 2011. So I got to do a lot of things very young in my career and really got to live my dream.
Absolutely, and we look forward to hearing more on that. At 24 years old, 25 years old, accomplishing anything at that level is very impressive, especially in the fashion world, which is, I'm sure you know.
In a foreign country.
In a foreign country, no less. And did you speak the language at the time?
I did speak French by that time. I had been in Paris for at least 2 or 3 years already. It took me a while to get the hang of French. And also I was attending Parsons, which, being an American school, the classes were in English. And the classes were so rigorous, I didn't really have time to take French. I just thought I was going to pick it up, but it took longer than I expected. But
Wow.
Eventually I got there.
And was it just from being assimilated with people of the culture? Or?
Yeah, it's true. I was lucky enough to study both Spanish and Italian in school. So I know what it's like to learn a language in a classroom setting, like with books and practice. And I learned French completely the other way, just basically picking it up from full immersion. I never took a French class, but I figured it out. I figured it out. I'm sure having had some foundation in other Romance languages was helpful, although French is still pretty unique. It's not exactly like Spanish.
Completely.
So
very cool.
Figured that out.
And at that early on, did you have an idea of what you wanted to do when you were 15, 16 years old? When did that initially start?
I did always have this dream of fashion, but from where I grew up in the Bay Area, that was a very far-fetched reality. It's not like I grew up in New York City where that industry has a presence, or even LA, I feel like has more of a presence than the San Francisco Bay Area. I think the closest that I could really get to the idea of fashion was actually just like walking around retail stores, which I did a lot when I was younger, just kind of like observing retail trends and being interested in clothes and really never being able to find what I wanted, which I think is like, no matter what you're doing in your career, is a great thread to follow to find a white space. And when I went to UC Berkeley, I also felt like, there's what I really am interested in is not here. And so when I finally got to move to Paris, which is, in my opinion, definitely like the city to be in if you love fashion, I finally felt like, oh, I'm here. Like, I'm here. I found my people. Yeah. Like, it was definitely the place for me to flourish there.
And was there a fear at that time of, if this doesn't work out, then what comes next? Or were you so certain that you...
Definitely. I mean, I think I had always done very well in school, and I had a 4.0 at UC Berkeley. And so just doing more school still didn't feel like taking a plunge. It's just going to a specialized school. But like, as school's coming to an end, like basically your whole conscious life, like you're only just thinking about like, what am I going to do this summer? And what about the next semester? And like your life is mapped out for you. So I do think like when you finally are ready to exit school, it's totally daunting. And I didn't right away exactly know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted it to be fashion related. And one good thing I had done was during my undergraduate years, I had taken every summer opportunity. I'd done a lot of like summer programs and internships to explore the idea of fashion through a lot of different lanes, because you could identify that you love an industry, but there's so many different ways to participate in an industry. So like after my freshman year of college, I got an internship at Elle magazine in New York. And that was fantastic because at the end of that, I realized, I'm not interested in covering fashion.
Right.
I don't want to work in a magazine, but it was so great that I understood what a magazine does. The following year, I actually worked in a PR showroom that was representing different fashion lines. So like I got to sort of see what that environment was like.
Sure.
And I also worked as a fit model for a fashion designer. So I got to go inside a fashion studio and see like, well, what does that look like? And I think with each thing you expose yourself to, you refine your sense of, how do I fit into this?
Right.
And so by the time I got to Parsons, and I remember on registration day, I told this to the headmistress and she totally gave me like this French look like, yeah, right. I was like, well, I'm just planning to be here for a very short time and I'll be starting my own life. Like I had that clarity by the time I started.
Really?
Like I remember one of my classmates told me like in the first semester, like, you're like a walking mood board. And I didn't totally know what to make of that comment, but like in hindsight, I was like, oh, that's great. It just means like he could already see like what the Erin brand was.
Right.
Because everything
everything
you're expressing is like adding up to a cohesive vision. And I think like no matter what kind of a brand you're developing, you need to have like an essence to it.
Right.
And that came to me naturally.
And then when you were building out this line initially, Can you run us through what does that look like? I'm sure it's hours and hours of.
I'll tell you, because listen, really, what would have been the natural next step for me would have been to just get an internship in Paris. And here's like the funny part of the story. That's what I wanted to do. That's what my other classmates were doing. And I would have been happy to do that. Like, it doesn't take that long. You just spend a summer, 3 to 6 months. Like, that would have been really valuable. I could not get the proper visa paperwork together for, they call it a stagiaire visa in Paris. Stagiaire is like their way of saying internship.
Okay.
And you need to get a special visa for it. And I just couldn't get that paperwork. I didn't know why. It was like, there was like a bureaucratic blockage.
Okay.
So I was like, well, I'm not going to waste my time with that. I'll just start, I have a concept. I'm just going to start making clothes. And I literally just was very determined, and I had very little resources. I remember I went to a fabric. They have like a big international fabric fair where all the fabric bills come and set up. It's called Première Vision. Okay. It's in Paris. And I remember going there and just like talking to the different fabric vendors, because even like, how are you going to buy fabric the first time?
Right.
It like breaking in to something professional when you're a student isn't that obvious. I remember chatting in Italian with the owner of this Italian silk mill, and I think he thought that was surprising and charming that I could chat with him in Italian, that he gave me €1,000 credit to buy some silk from him, which is like only going to get you a few yards. And I had this beautiful French lace company called Solstice also. They were like, well, we'll give you €1,000 worth of lace. And really between those two, it was like enough to make like 30 scanty like outfits. I just like wrote them a letter and just
charming, and
I mean, like, in looking back, like that was such a big deal to me, but to them, like, it probably wasn't that big of a deal.
Sure.
And like, good on them for throwing like a bone to like young talent.
Right.
And I ended up making like a bunch of outfits, and I just thought, oh, well, I'll go and show them at a sales trade show and see if I could get sales. And then I called the trade show, and they sell you a booth that is priced by square footage. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if they were just trying to like upsell me or if it was true, but they basically told me that, the only booth left, it was very large.
And most expensive.
Yeah, it was going to be like 10,000 euros.
Right.
Okay. And I was thinking to myself, for 10,000 euros, I could probably put on a runway show.
Right.
Like, I think I could do something more exciting than just rent this
Having
booth.
A booth here.
So I gave up on the booth idea. I had one friend who was a journalist in fashion in Paris, and she came over and she looked at my collection, and she could see what she caught the vision.
Right.
And she made a great suggestion to me to show off calendar during the week of Haute Couture in Paris.
Okay.
Which is basically like finding a loophole into getting yourself on the calendar. And the minute she said it, I was like, yes, that is exactly what I'm doing, And I can look back on my career, like, there have been moments where I had this like strong feeling of like, yes, that's the plan. And that was one of them. And the next step was finding a PR person who would go out on a limb to do this with me.
Believe in your line enough to...
And believe me, I think I talked to every PR in Paris that to my face were like, yeah, that's great. We'll love to help you. But actually nobody came back with a yes until because in Paris, like, America is very pro-youth.
Sure.
And like into like a young phenomenon. But France, like, the culture is a little bit different.
They want established.
So they want people, like, they want to see a CV, like a big resume. So being this like 24-year-old American girl with basically no resume, I think it was just looking too risky for them.
Sure.
But I did finally find the woman who had helped me, Beatrice Monceau. I'm still so grateful to her. And she had had a long career in fashion PR in Paris. And I didn't know why she decided that she would take a chance on me. And I remember I went to this hotel and I basically begged them, like, could I use like a space in your hotel? And they gave it to me for basically nothing. Like everything was a miracle. Like I did it with really very little money. And even the models, they were just came and did it. Cause it was like,
to help you out.
I don't know. I had like a lot of benevolence towards me in the beginning. And it's so funny because looking back on that show, like, oh my God, it's like embarrassing. Like it's totally an amateur show. Like the pacing was very slow. Like we didn't have enough people backstage, like change the outfits for it to go like fast enough, but it somehow worked. And we had a fantastic turnout. And I think that there was like a novelty factor that people were curious about, like, who's this young American girl? And like, what are these clothes? The clothes were like very fantasy, very out there, very different from what was going on at that moment in fashion. And it just kind of like took off.
Right after that show, it started.
It took off. And then I had a few other like amazing serendipitous things happen for me that just helped me take like big impactful steps right at the beginning.
And then moving from that to where you are now and all the successes you had through that, were the lessons learned early on applicable throughout the rest of your life? Or is it an ever-going process that you feel you're constantly learning and adapting to?
I think there's something about being young that like even I wish I could still hold on to more, which is having nothing to lose. And this like fearlessness. And you haven't had too much negative feedback yet.
Right. You haven't been hit enough times.
You're kind of like not crushed,
right.
And that was definitely the case for me. And like the irony is that over the course of 13 years, I was able to really build my brand, build a team. At the peak, I had a staff of 30, which is not like huge, but like
substantial. When
you start as a one-woman show,
right,
it's a lot to grow to there. And we had like so many accounts, and you become like this very responsible business. Like then you're like constantly getting feedback, because you need to be good at so many other things. Like in the beginning, it just had to be like, I just need to have a vision and get it across to people.
Right.
As you grow a business, you don't even know what you need to become good at. You need to become good at accounting and financing and HR and, understanding legal matters. Like none of that is happening when you're like coming out of Parson in your mind. So you have to grow to have a business to support what the artistry or the passion is. And I think that was always hard, or I just felt like it just wasn't fun. I mean, it wasn't that fun for me. It's like the accounting, I was like, oh God.
I want to make clothing.
You have to become responsible. And so I know that I grew so much as a person to basically like grow and nurture the business to support the art. And then at the end, what ultimately ended up happening for me was, I had really lived my dream, my fashion dream. I lived it. Like, I'm so grateful that I got to have the experience and like just no regrets. And I also think I got to have that like a special moment in time.
Right.
Like, even if I think I tried to do all of that again now, it's just a different world.
Completely.
So, I just feel like I got to live something really special, a special moment in time. When I started, there was no social media. I started in 2005.
Right.
So it was just like a completely different world.
How were you getting the product out there? Was it word of mouth mostly? Fashion shows?
I think traditional medium press was very important. And then you just getting in the right shows, the right stores.
Sure.
I had a great showroom that took me on, Showroom 7.
Okay. And that was in Paris or New York?
They were in New York.
Okay.
That's the Ericksons.
Sure.
And they helped me. You need it takes a whole infrastructure to get a fashion brand out into the world. And then you need to have your manufacturing tight and factories. Right. And when I started, the norm was 2 seasons a year. Then within a few years, it was, you better be doing 4 seasons in a year. by the time it was 2016, 2017, we were doing 14 deliveries a year.
Wow.
Which is really intense. And so I think there's about 100 unique styles per delivery. It's a lot.
Wow.
So it became this really intense hamster wheel. And so I had gotten married and I had my first child, and I did the business for the first year of his life. And I came to the end of that year and I said, okay, so it was a really good year for the business, actually. It was like our best. Like, we achieved so much that year. But I said, like, okay, so you proved it. You could do this. You could have your baby. You could grow your business. And then I just had this, like, honest conversation with myself, but, like, why do you need to do this? And for me, it was, I had just, like, a moment where I felt that I was good. It was good. What I had done, I was really satisfied. And I just had this feeling that I'm not going to be able to continue to do both of these very important things well at the same time.
Raising a child and running.
Yeah. I wanted to be a very hands-on mom. I wanted to be with my children the majority of the time. I didn't want to outsource that. And I know what is required to have a successful fashion business, and it is, you know,
it's very time consuming.
It's all consuming. Right. It's your whole existence. And for me, it was, you know, the brand was my name, and I was the face of the brand. I mean, it was my whole identity. So I just didn't feel like I could continue to do both. So I felt like it was a tough decision, but I closed my fashion brand so I could focus on motherhood. And fortunately, like, that was a good decision. I made that decision in 2017, and part of my thought process is I just felt that fashion as an industry was inherently dysfunctional as a business model.
Really?
And I felt that myself, as a relatively small player, wasn't going to have the ability to do much about that. You either comply or get off the train. And I felt like, gosh, I'm going to get so burnt out, possibly miss my son's childhood to what? Like, live to die another day.
Right.
You know, if I had been in tech or in an industry where you're seeing, like, you know, 10, 20x, like, exits, like, my thought process could have been different. Sure. But I just felt like I was personally fulfilled.
Right.
And, you know, I think I really made the right call. When the pandemic came along, I saw a lot of people who were in my same position, you know, go through a really hard time. Right. And I don't doubt that I would have been having the same fate. So it was nice that I was, like, kind of ahead of that curve.
With all of that, how did you still feel comfortable enough to let go of that identity, which was really from your early 20s up until that point?
It was, I'm not going to lie, it was like a total crisis. I think I had a total identity crisis.
How long was this thought process?
I mean, I think that first year was really tough. And while in that first year of my son's life, I was a very hands-on mom, I did have at least, like, a couple hours of childcare on weekdays so I could do my business. Yeah. And right when I closed my company, like, the nanny that had been with me, she chose to go get her graduate degree. And I thought, well, great. I'm going to live the life of a full-time mom. Right. Oh, that was a shock because I was like, some days I would just laugh. I'm like, wow, I used to live in a reality where I would, like, go to my office and I had 30 people there waiting to like take their marching orders and execute my vision. Right. And now I'm, like, serving at the pleasure of a tyrannical toddler, you know? You're like, I want scrambled eggs, and you serve it and it knocks them down. I was like, how is this my life? Right. So, you know, it was definitely an adjustment, and my identity was very much entwined in that business. So feeling that all goes so quiet, it was tough because I had to really look at, you know, how do you let your sense of self, how much do you let it be influenced by that like external feedback. I was living in Paris, and that was the same year that the Sofia Coppola movie of Marie Antoinette was being filmed. Kirsten Dunst was the star of that film. She is more or less my same age, so we're cohorts. We kept bumping into each other in Paris, and she was so sweet, and she always loved what I was wearing, and I was always wearing something I had made.
Right.
And so I was like, oh, let me give you some clothes. And she just thought that she was just very supportive. And she was like, I would love to help you. Like, I want to help you in your line. I think that's great. And I ended up making my third season. Kirsten ended up starring in a short film featuring my collection, which I had filmed by like a legendary, iconic fashion photographer named Ellen von Unworth, who I had met in the exact same way, like out at a party in Paris, love what you're wearing, like love your vibe, like let's do something together, just like that simple. And so in, the year coming off of like this big change, I remember I was hosting, I was living in LA, we had moved to LA, and of course I like decorated my own house.
Sure.
And I was hosting an event for a friend, and like these women came over and they were like, oh my gosh, I love your house, love the vibe of this living room. And then they shared with me that they were developing a women's co-working space here in Los Angeles. And they said, like, would you design the house for us? Like, we want it to feel just like your house. And I was like thinking to myself, like, well, could I do that? Like, I've designed my own homes, I've designed my own office, but I wasn't thinking of myself like in those terms. They're like, I even was like, do I have the skills? And I was like, yes, I think I can do it. And what I did to make sure that I succeeded was I found a really good assistant who had been an interior designer, who had years of working experience, because I think that especially in creative industries, the vision is very important, but it does boil down to execution, and you must be able to execute. So I felt like, well, if I'm going to take a big step here, and this was a high profile project, and I'm going to come out as an interior designer, I need to make sure that I'm bringing like someone to make sure that we execute properly. Right. And so she was a great partner. That was like my first project, and then it just kind of would pick up momentum. So a lot of the girls that had loved my clothes for many years were like, you're doing houses now? I need you to come and do my house. So the next project I did was for the actress Jenna Dewan. Okay. And she had just moved to a new home, and she was going through a transition in her life. And she asked me could I come and design it? And I was able to bring in All Modern as a furniture partner, just sort of like, having a mind for branding. I was able to connect the dots to make something interesting for everyone. Sure. Me as the designer, interesting furniture brand. They get an interesting person to feature. So it was like a win-win for everybody. And that was, profiled in like People magazine. And it was like a pretty good second project for me. It takes from beginning to end of a project, it took almost 2 years. So that product is just in stores now. We launched it just two months ago.
Wow, congrats. Very cool.
But that was great for me because they called me to do a home collection, and then we were just having such a good time in the design process that they called me one day. They're like, we need to do fashion too. Like, okay. And Anthropologie used to be one of my like main vendors of my collection. We did very well. So we have a history of doing business together, and Erin Fetherston clothing was sold there a lot. So it was like a really fun full circle moment to be able to do a fashion collection alongside the home collection and have it live at Anthropologie.
Where do you garner your inspiration for new designs, for new art, with whether it's home, whether it's fashion?
I've always used like just my personal taste as like a compass. So like I shared with you in the very, very beginning, like I just remember like no matter where I was, I would just like walk stores endlessly. And I could never really find what I was looking for. And when it came to furniture design, I had just gone through the process of, we had just gotten a new home. We got a new home to prepare for the birth of our third child. We needed a little more room. Sure. And I was like using those nesting hormones that you get when you're pregnant to like overdrive design this new house because I wanted everything to be ready for when baby was born. So to do that, I had just been like so deep into the market, like looking at everything, sourcing everything. And so I was hyper aware of what I wanted but couldn't find. So the opportunity to actually design furniture couldn't have come at a better time because it was so fresh in my mind of like, well, what would I want if I could have anything and I could make anything? So that white space is
allowed the opening for it.
Yeah.
It sounds like, I'm sure there was challenges along the way too, and you mentioned a few, but it sounds like life has flowed through, whether it's, your artistic mind or the way you move around life. It's really a flow state. It doesn't feel like you didn't force the fashion line. You didn't force it, right? It's like you had an opening for it. Like you said, there was that white space, and then it became a passion and ultimately a career. What do you think allowed you to be that type of person? Was it the way you were raised? Was it things you were exposed to early on in life?
I think there were some really special aspects to my childhood that like set me up for this, and I'm so grateful for them. One, I had really an upbringing that really nurtured my imagination and creativity. I think I'm just so lucky that like whether it was theater or just my mom facilitating like amazing art projects at home, my parents also were so incredible to have me travel a lot of the world with them that I think when you're young, you're just like such a sponge. You don't even realize what you're picking up. But I think, my parents were really allowed for me to have like exposure to this creativity very young. And two, my parents were both very entrepreneurial, and they really raised me with an entrepreneurial mindset. I'm an only child, so I feel like most of our family dinners from at least like age 9 up, and I had my first business when I was 9.
Really?
Critter sitters. That was a neighborhood dog walking business. Okay. Critter sitters. I mean, I had a card, I had logo, I had a whole thing. I had a pretty good business for a 9-year-old in my neighborhood. But my parents really raised me to think about like, we would just, the dinner table conversation would be like, well, make up a pretend business and like, tell me how you're going to do it.
Okay.
And then, like, I used to think my dad was such a, like, he was so tough, because he would poke holes.
You're like, let me have one
like,
good idea,
right?
Where's the optimism?
But actually, like, they were really building my mindset to do my own thing. So, like, I think that even when I was telling you the story of how I came out of school and I couldn't get the internship papers, so I was like, let me go around that obstacle. Right. Like I could just do this, or, the trade show's so much money for just a booth. Like, I think if I'm going to invest like that, like what else could I do with it? Right. And so just like this mindset of like, whatever you get, I got 1,000 euros of free fabric. Like, how could I turn that into something? It's like, how can you take something small and like make something more of it?
Sure.
And I think that's always been, a gift that I'm grateful for, is like this inner resourcefulness of like taking something small and figuring out how to like turn it into something.
Right.
And, I always had you're going to work for yourself mentality.
Oh, really? It was always
very much. And that was very much from the way my parents raised me.
And so it's apparent that you're a spiritual being because of your kindness and willingness to help others. Where has spirituality throughout your life helped, supported business, professional, your family life?
It helps everything, and I only wish that I had a foundation of spirituality even earlier in my life. There's many ways to define success, and something that became more and more important to me, especially as I was studying spirituality, was just that like also everyone who is involved, just make sure everyone's having a good experience. And when I look back on like the years that I had in my company with my office, like I have a huge smile thinking about the people who were there and like what a great time we had together. And there was like a magic in that. And, you know, sometimes like your sales are high, sometimes they're not as high as you want, sometimes you could have a crisis. But like if you're having like if everyone's kind of having a good experience, even in the face of like challenges, which there will be, I feel like that's a very enduring feeling.
And that might even be more important than the monetary success that comes with it.
It's all important, and it's important if you also want to create monetary success for everyone who becomes like involved in whatever your endeavor is. That's a part of it. You know, you want everyone to benefit from whatever undertaking is at hand. But I think for me, just having like having consciousness and really every undertaking being proactive confrontation, that's like my area where I struggle. You know, having certainty and really like in the transition that I went through where my identity was so enmeshed in a commercial product, in a commercial brand, that even though that really felt like an expression of my soul, I had to also separate myself from a product.
Right.
And from something commercial. And I think that ultimately is about finding your value within and always having a connection to the creator is where you really draw your strength and worth.
Beautiful. We live in a world where there's a lot of superficial nature, and you don't really get to sense or feel people until you sit down and talk with them. So we ask this to all our guests, but if people can know one thing about you that isn't inherently known, what would you want that to be?
That's a really good question. That's a good question because the question is really, what do you think people perceive of you?
Right.
Right? So one doesn't always have necessarily an accurate sense of how they're seen. So I think I would just want people to know that I'm actually like also just on a journey, making mistakes, learning from life. I think that being a designer, the nature of that business is to really project like beauty and perfection, and a lot of like thought goes into that. But that doesn't mean that like every day is beautiful and perfect.
Right.
You know, I'm also just here living a human experience. I got toddlers throwing their plate of food in my face.
Right. And doing your best.
It's hard. Yeah, I'm just also doing my best.
Right.
And I would want people to know that I'm very approachable. I'm always really happy. I really love it when people ask me for help, or like I love to help people.
Right. That's beautiful. And I think somebody that's had the success you have and the personality that you do, it might seem like you have your own life and you're busy. And so I think even saying that to our younger audience, any woman who's aspiring, to know that yourself and others like you are willing to help and have a desire to is, right, they're not alone in the process. Beautiful. And so the last thing we'll finish with is, it's tied into the previous question we asked you about your own personal journey, but if there was anything, whether it's your children or you just want somebody who's just navigating through life like we all are, to know or to understand at a young age that can save them challenges and maybe pain later on in life, what would that thing be?
Well, I would say that, okay, well, this is debatable because I know that there's a Kabbalistic perspective that says like our soul chooses everything,
Sure.
which I agree with. Our soul chooses our family and our parents and our children and all of that. But I think you do have one very big choice to make in life, and that is your partner selection. And because you get to really consciously, actively choose that person. If you feel marriage is for you, choosing the right partner is a very important choice. And I think that really looking at something my dad said to me when I was younger, and he didn't say too much on the topic. And I just kind of thought, like, I don't know, sure, Dad, choose someone who has a really nice family. Okay, I will. But I think the essence of what he's saying is that you might meet someone in a moment in time and you get an impression, you get a feeling. But I do think that really taking the time to understand someone's family is a very important part of the picture.
Right. That is huge. And as myself, who isn't married yet, I'm going to hold that into account. Erin, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, and I'm sure we'll have you again on soon. It was valuable not just for me, but I'm sure for both men and women that are listening to this podcast. And thank you for having us at your home. It's been awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erin.